Good afternoon. The subcommittee, I'm glad to lead here. I appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you this Congress, especially Ranking Member Blumenauer and each member of this committee. I would also like to thank our witnesses for being here today. This is, as you know, an important topic. Today's hearing examines why the United States must lead on trade, especially in the face of China's aggressive trade and investment agenda. Concerns about the Chinese Communist Party's global influence and predatory trade practices are not only shared by every member of this committee, these concerns are bipartisan and bicameral. We've seen firsthand how China seeks to weaponize trade to expand its influence and undercut U.S. workers and values. These actions should create a mandate for the United States of America to lead on trade issues. But unfortunately, such a mandate has seemingly gone unnoticed by the administration. Across the board, China seeks to dominate global trade and supply chains. They're using all tools at their disposal to advance their Made in China 2025 initiative. Today, we will hear why the United States must lead from a position of strength. We can do this by addressing the CCP's practices directly while simultaneously using trade programs, agreements, and other tools to show we are a reliable and attractive alternative for nations around the world. The CCP seeks to erode America's competitive edge through intellectual property theft, discrimination against American exporters and investors, and a wide range of advantages provided to state-owned enterprises within China. They have made no secret of their desire to replace the United States as the dominant global power. We cannot and will not allow this to happen. China continues to grow its global ambitions. Take, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has become a tool for the CCP to trap partners in developing countries into endless cycles of debt and control. This is happening in every region of the world, from the Indo-Pacific to our own backyard, right here in the Western Hemisphere. No country is immune to this aggressive behavior. Partners like Australia, South Korea, and Lithuania have experienced this firsthand. While we can be encouraged these instances of attempted economic coercion backfired, Beijing continues its brazen attempts to bully nations into submission. In my view, there's no treading water on trade matters. You're either moving ahead or you are losing ground. And right now, we are losing ground while China forges ahead with a trade agenda that cheats to shape the global playing field in its favor. Our trading partners around the world are hoping the U.S. will stand up and provide a unified, bipartisan American trade agenda to hold the CCP and other bad actors accountable. We can do this while partnering in a deeper and more consequential way with our allies. The role of Congress cannot be ignored for this effort, which is why Congress must use its constitutionally given authority to set deliverables and provide critical oversight of all trade matters. Crafting a trade promotion authority bill to put Congress in the driver's seat, reauthorizing critical trade programs aimed at increasing American competitiveness, and continuing efforts to add consequences for China's trade practices are all things we can and should pursue right now. Our trade policy is at its strongest, its most durable, effective, sustainable, and inclusive when elected representatives are driving and shaping it. We saw this firsthand as this committee reinvigorated our North American trading relationships through the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. We need to build on and replicate this important work, and I'm confident this committee can do so. I'm excited to get to work. With that, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for his opening statement.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your enthusiasm and some of the optimistic things that we can do. We had similar hearings in the last Congress to highlight the Chinese government's state-led, non-market, anti-competitive approach that threatens American workers and business. I hope we can all agree that now is a time to move from rhetoric to action. We led efforts to pass forceful legislation in the trade title in the America Competes Act that helped workers and firms who have been displaced by offshoring to China. It incorporated many of the concepts and values that enjoyed the broad bipartisan support that you mentioned in terms of the NAFTA revisions. We would close the de minimis loophole, strengthen our trade remedy laws, create an outbound screen for Chinese investments, and update the miscellaneous tariff bill to exclude finished goods, more than half of which come from China and undercut American manufacturers. This legislation is meant to level the playing field so that American workers and businesses are no longer disadvantaged by the Chinese double standard. For some reason, Mr. Chairman, we were unable to move this forward with Republican support in the last Congress. But I hope that we can do that now to match again the rhetoric with legislative action. American workers and business can no longer wait. The USTR's report on Congress on China's WTO compliance makes clear that China has an abominable record. 20 years of WTO membership, and they still embrace a non-market approach despite China's own commitments that it would pursue open market-oriented policies. If anything, China has doubled down on its anti-competitive trade distorting practices. Today, China is the world's leading offender in creating non-market capacity, as evidenced by the severe and persistent excess capacity in several industries, particularly steel and aluminum. And of course, the Chinese production methods are some of the dirtiest in the world. The resulting overproduction and pollution has distorted global markets and contributed to massive increase in carbon pollution, harming American workers and manufacturers, as well as third countries, where American exports of steel products compete with exports from China. We'll hear from one of our witnesses today, Roy Hausman from the United Steelworkers, and about legislation my friend Terry Sewell has introduced to address some of these unfair trade practices. China continues to exploit the loophole in our customs law. Some Chinese companies have developed a business model centered on exploiting the de minimis provision to evade oversight at the border, avoid paying duties, and undercutting American companies who are playing by the rules. Because of this loophole, there's no way to tell how many of the more than 2 million packages a day contain products made through forced labor, intellectual property theft, or otherwise dangerous. Chinese textile industry benefits from the deplorable treatment and forced labor of the Uyghurs and other minorities in the Xinjiang region of China. Lack of oversight at the American border makes it even more difficult for CBP to intercept these shipments. And as noted by Mr. Hausman, the de minimis loophole can even allow evasion of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Closing the de minimis loophole and addressing forced labor, the fruits of modern-day slavery have no place in the American market. This subcommittee can send a clear signal to China that the United States will unequivocally protect worker and human rights. And we must continue to encourage our allies to boldly respond to China's unfair practices. I stand ready to work with my Republican colleagues on China-related legislation and turn our rhetoric into action. I appreciated the optimistic tone that you took, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a lot of common ground that we can build upon, and I look forward to working with you and the committee on that.
Thank you. Now I'm pleased to recognize the chairman of the Full Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, for holding this hearing. Today's subcommittee hearing comes at a time when Americans are increasingly concerned about the Chinese Communist Party and its harmful influence around the world, especially here at home. Republicans and Democrats often talk about our differences, but today we are here to share a common message. The folks who fuel, feed, and build our country have become collateral damage in China's aggressive trade agenda. It's time we stood up for them. It's time to combat China's human rights abuses, predatory trade practices, espionage, and theft that for too long have threatened our supply chains and cheated American farmers, manufacturers, families, and workers. As we sit here, the Chinese Communist Party is unleashing a wide range of aggressive tactics in its attempt to dominate critical supply chains, including massive industrial subsidies, forced technology transfers, and intellectual property theft. The CCP is spreading its harmful influence across the globe. I saw this firsthand in South America during my first international trip as Ways and Means Chairman. China is increasingly active, including in our own backyard, and a bipartisan response is needed. I'm concerned that the White House's decision to exclude Congress from trade only emboldens China and ignores the voices of the American people. Frameworks and dialogues are no substitute for congressionally binding action on trade. We ought to put workers and farmers at the center of American trade policy. Americans are still owed clarity and answers from the White House about China's compliance with Phase 1 obligations and plans to hold it accountable. We should build on USMCA's progress through strong enforcement, including standing with Americans who are harmed when our trading partners do not live up to their end of the agreement. We should be developing a plan to use our authority over trade and to use our leverage as a nation to strengthen critical supply chains and reduce dependence on adversarial nations like China and Russia. This is a bipartisan effort, and I'm hopeful we can make headway today. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will now introduce our witnesses. Today we are joined by 5 witnesses. First, Mark McHargue, president of none other than the Nebraska Farm Bureau. It is great to have you before the subcommittee to...
Nebraska Farm?
That's right, the Nebraska Farm Bureau. For your perspective, it's certainly helpful for you to be on the panel. Thank you for making the trip to Washington. Second, we have Jamison Greer, partner at King and Spalding and former USTR Chief of Staff. Thank you for being here. Third, we have Thomas Dusterberg, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Fourth, we have Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President and Simon Chair in Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, otherwise known as CSIS. And fifth, we have Roy Hausman, the Legislative Director of the United Steelworkers. Mr. McHargue, your written statement will be made a part of the record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Mark McHargue. I am a conventional and organic row crop farmer and hog producer from Merritt County, Nebraska. I currently serve as president of Nebraska Farm Bureau and also serve on the board of American Farm Bureau, as well as serve on their trade committee. Nebraska Farm Bureau Federation is pleased to offer these comments on the current state of the agricultural trade relationship between United States and China. China remains a vital market for Nebraska goods and is consistently a top 3 market for Nebraska products, year in and year out. At the same time, America and Nebraska farmers and ranchers are also aware and are also concerned about the current geopolitical and national security concerns that exist between our nations. Prior to 2018, Nebraska's agriculture exports to China ranged about $936 million to a little over $1 billion. Currently, that equates to about 15% of Nebraska's total exports. The value at that time, prior to 18, was about $20,000 per farm. That would equate to my farm as well. In 2022, we set a new record of selling agricultural goods into China at $40 billion or so. When you divide that by per farm, that's about $55,000 per farmer or rancher in Nebraska. But I also need to point out that despite these significant growths, U.S. market share in China's market remained relatively stagnant in 22. At about 18% of the ag market was U.S. market. That's declined from about 22% from 2013 to 2017. I run through all this data to highlight just how complex the relationship is between the significant competitor and customers. Farmers and ranchers have the same geopolitical and national security, copyright, and trade law concerns that most of you have and many in the industry have. At the same time, China's role as a significant consumer of raw U.S. commodities, not just high-value processed foods, but raw commodities, they're also able to move grain and livestock markets any day by simply making an order, or in the case of 2018 or 19, not placing an order. Given everything happening in the world today, the United States should be actively working every day to diversify our list of trading partners. Quite frankly, the biggest disappointment that we in agriculture have with the Biden administration has been their non-existent effort to find new trading partners and pursue negotiations on any new free trade agreement. If I had the opportunity to sit down with President Biden today, I would tell him 2 things as it relates to trade specifically with China. Number one, sitting back and allowing the rest of the world to finalize new free trade agreements that increase market access and lower tariffs isn't leading, and it sure doesn't send the right message to our competitors or allies. Rejoining the CPTPP and re-engaging with the UK as well as countries like Kenya or on actual free trade agreements would be a great place to start. Whether we like it or not, number two, China is an important customer. Again, we need them, they need us. At the same time, we absolutely have to hold China accountable to their WTO trade obligations. Fixing market access issues that remain on several sanitary and phytosanitary issues on agricultural products, such as the use of riboflavin in pork, and protecting against issues like intellectual property theft are all key. We must do what we can to ensure our own national security. We must ensure China is playing by the rules. We must also ensure that we aren't continuing to lose access to vital markets. In closing, I want to again thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Trade is a foundational issue that serves on the basis for our modern global economy. It's an issue that helps lift millions out of poverty, and it's an issue that helps U.S. farmers and ranchers feed billions of families around the globe. At this time of continued economic and geopolitical uncertainty, the United States must tell the world we are open for business. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, you're recognized.
Morning, Chairman, Ranking Member, and members. As Ambassador Lighthizer Chief of Staff, I had the opportunity to sit with him in many meetings with you and groups and individually and hear your nuanced and thoughtful views on trade. I'm happy to be here today. I should note before beginning that I'm appearing in my personal capacity and that none of my comments today can be attributed to any current or former employer or client. This hearing is focused on how America can be successful in our competition with China in the face of its aggressive trade and investment policies. Although certain companies or discrete industries have found some success in relying on China in their supply chains or export business, Chinese unfair trading practices have sapped the competitiveness of U.S. companies and workers, resulting in hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade deficits with China. Economic studies estimate that the U.S. has lost at least 3.7 million manufacturing jobs, tens of thousands of factories, following China's accession to the World Trade Organization. WTO membership enabled China's meteoric rise, which has been fueled and funded by China's exports to and investment received from the United States. Thus, while our working classes have lost jobs and our supply chains have foundered, China's manufacturing base is incredibly robust and its military position has strengthened. These trends have a direct impact on the global balances of power and international peace and security. China has a plan to be the economic leader of the world, and then to use that position to export its own model of governance globally. So we can't lose sight of that as we talk about trade and economic relationship with China. You will see this idea referred to in Chinese government discourse by the term the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. According to writings and speeches of Chinese officials, including Xi Jinping, the plan is to achieve overwhelming global hegemony by 2049. In describing the strategy, Xi Jinping has said that China is, and I quote, building a socialism that is superior to capitalism and laying the foundation for a future where we win the initiative, win the advantage, and win the future, close quote. China's trade policies and practices are a key part of this. My written testimony goes into more detail, but they have a number of non-market practices that are harmful, including pursuing a strategy of dual circulation that prioritizes Chinese domestic production and discourages imports. Massive subsidies to favored companies or industries, regardless of their profitability, market demand, or natural comparative advantages. Construction of excess capacity in key manufacturing industries. High non-reciprocal tariffs on U.S. imports. Non-tariff barriers on imports like pseudo-scientific requirements and other regulatory obstacles. Forced technology transfer, which we could talk about for days. Discrimination against U.S. goods and services. Opaque and discriminatory government procurement programs. Periodic currency manipulation. The list goes on. As I noted, these practices have contributed to the hollowing out of our own manufacturing base. The question is, what do we do? While many policies can affect our economy, such as tax, monetary, industrial policy, energy policy, trade policy plays a key role as well. We can talk about negotiations and market access, which are important, but I want to focus a little bit on enforcement. In 2018, when I was at USTR, you will know that we started an investigation under Section 301 of forced technology transfer. After enforcing the results of that investigation, we ended up with substantial tariffs on Chinese imports, especially including those that benefited from forced technology transfer. And then we concluded with the Phase 1 agreement with China, where they allowed us to keep the tariffs in place, which gives us some room for leverage and enforcement. And importantly, where they also agreed to substantive changes with respect to agricultural regulations, financial services, intellectual property. They made commitments. And the important thing as well about the agreement is that it had an enforcement mechanism, one that was established where on a monthly, quarterly, and semi-annual basis, leaders in the United States and China could get together to resolve these issues and resolve them before they became conflagrations. I haven't seen that enforcement mechanism being used, and maybe things are going on behind the scenes, but I don't know. I think it would behoove the government to do an assessment of Chinese compliance or non-compliance, as the case may be, with the Phase 1 trade agreement and how to enforce it. There are a variety of other ways we can enforce. I would say we should consider either revoking permanent normal trade relations with China, or at least going back to a world where we look at where we were with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, on an annual basis, Congress and/or the President looking at whether China should continue to receive most favored nation status. And we should use sanctions on China where appropriate. We should continue to use export controls. We should use Section 301, Section 232 where appropriate. We should take actions in government procurement to ensure that we don't have products used in our contracts and programs from suspect Chinese companies. I do want to note diversification of trade, which we just heard from Mr. McHarg. It's very important. I think we should engage in sectoral negotiations with places like the Philippines and Kenya and the United Kingdom to make sure we can get market access. We need to be very careful. To the extent there are any trade agreements, they should incorporate the great things you all agreed to in the USMCA on labor and environment and rules of origin. And I'll yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. Mr. Duesterberg, please proceed. You want to turn on your microphone?
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, members of the subcommittee, thanks for having me today to comment on this important topic. I want to note first from the outset that China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping and the CCP, has pursued a policy of achieving economic independence and as much dominance in the world economy as possible. In a real sense, they are pursuing a policy of decoupling using the tools of mercantilist policies, which many of you have already noted. They also want to free their economy from dependence on the dollar so that economic sanctions using the financial system cannot be used against them. The economic impact on U.S. manufacturing and increasingly on the financial and digital commerce sectors is well known. I want to emphasize in my work that the Chinese economy exhibits growing weaknesses under CCP leadership. The policies I will suggest to address the Chinese mercantilism are in part designed to take advantage of these weaknesses and undermine the ability of the Chinese leadership to achieve its economic and political goals. The IMF and the World Bank are both projecting much weaker growth in China, and I believe they underestimate this weakness. My written testimony has some detail about why I think the Chinese economy is weak. Growth in China in the past has been driven by massive capital investment, growth in consumption, and aggressive exploitation of open global markets to create persistent trade surpluses. But in recent years, investment returns have weakened, the housing bubble has burst, the government and banking balance sheets have been overleveraged, and consumer spending constrained by the demographic decline and the need for precautionary savings to pay for education, healthcare, and old age. In these circumstances, China is even more dependent on access to Western finance and foreign markets for driving growth. Because of this dependency, the U.S. trade and investment policies, such as those already in place, can and should be reinforced to take advantage of these growing weaknesses and, hopefully, to induce change in Chinese mercantilist policies. The policies I want to emphasize first are in trade, enforcement of WTO obligations, and deployment of U.S. unilateral trade instruments. Mr. Greer and others have already commented on some of these. I agree that the Phase 1 agreement should be enforced, but also that many U.S. because of the weaknesses of the WTO structure, we should continue to use unilateral tools available in the United States to pursue our goals. Finally, I want to emphasize that the U.S. should re-emphasize the WTO concept of reciprocity. Chinese protectionist practices, such as its failure to provide access to Western digital platforms, payment systems, and social media, while its firms enjoy access to Western markets, should be fought back against by prohibiting online retailers such as Alibaba and Shein to be banned, and also social platforms like TikTok and WeChat. Finally, the United States should emphasize the creation and use of regional trade agreements. I think we need to be present on the playing field, including negotiating to rejoin the CPTPP. In terms of investment tools, the U.S. should consider more vigorous efforts to discourage or prohibit investments in Chinese firms where national security is endangered. We do need a reverse CFIUS process. We should cover research projects and venture capital investment as part of the reverse CFIUS process. We should also, in terms of financial policy, label China as a currency manipulator. This action should undermine confidence in the renminbi as Beijing tries to attract more foreign investment and make it a bigger part of trade finance. Finally, the United States should address the growing debt crisis in the developing world, which is linked in important ways to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Nearly half of foreign debt in the developing world is now in the form of Chinese loans, which are normally at market rates and not subject to Paris Club negotiations. According to the IMF, up to 60% of the developing world countries show clear signs of financial distress, and at a minimum, the United States and allies should require China to participate in restructuring using Paris Club norms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Goodman, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I was asked to talk about a recent CSIS report on China's economic coercion, and I'll do that in a moment, but I'd like to first make two broader points about trade, if I may. The first is the United States needs trade. Trade creates growth, it creates jobs, it creates export opportunities for U.S. businesses, farmers, ranchers. Trade lowers costs for not only individual consumers, but for downstream producers that can then invest in more jobs. So yes, trade does dislocate some jobs, and we need a more robust set of domestic policies, real adjustment assistance, worker retraining, incentives for investment in new jobs to deal with that dislocation. But we should still trade. We also need trade agreements to amplify the growth, jobs, and cost reduction benefits of trade itself, but also for strategic reasons. Which leads to my second point. Frankly, we're losing ground in the critical Indo-Pacific region, which is what I mainly focus on, both economically and strategically, because we're not willing to negotiate formal trade agreements. When I say losing ground, I mean not only to China, but also we're losing the confidence of our own allies and partners in the region. I hear this all the time. Yes, we've offered the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, which has some value, but our partners are skeptical about what's in it for them, and they want us back in formal trade negotiations. China is doing trade agreements. It's even applied to join the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we created. Almost everyone else in the region is doing trade agreements. The United States is standing on the sidelines while new rules are being set and markets are being divvied up by others. We need to get back in the game. Another reason to do trade agreements, and the one I was asked to speak about today in particular, is to counter China's economic coercion. In our recent report, we looked at 8 case studies over the past decade plus, from Japan rare earths in 2010 to Lithuania today, and we concluded that China is a serial coercer using its growing market power to take swipes at our allies and partners for perceived slights to Beijing's interests. Although China's coercion often fails in its tactical aims and can be counterproductive to Beijing's own strategic interests, pushing countries away from China and toward us, China's behavior is disruptive and divisive, and we need to do more to deter Beijing from doing it. There are two basic ways to deter someone from doing something. One is to make them fear punishment, and the other is to make them fear failure. Tit-for-tat retaliation is tempting, but it has three big problems. First, if it's proportional to China's typically low-level coercion, it isn't likely to change Chinese behavior. But if we escalate, we lose credibility. How much of a cost are we realistically willing to pay to defend other countries' bananas or wine? And finally, we found in our study that most of our trading partners don't want us to retaliate, since the bullying of them is likely to resume as soon as we leave the playground. In the end, we were drawn to a counter-strategy of resilience and relief, helping partners find new markets, which makes them less exposed to China, and offering them relief if they do get coerced. Trade policy plays a role in both resilience and relief. By negotiating trade agreements, we expand partners' options and make them less fearful of losing China's market. By offering trade relief, we help offset the costs of coercion and persuade our allies that we have their back. Combined with a number of other recommended policy responses in our report, we believe these resilience and relief measures will help persuade Beijing over time that its coercion won't succeed. So to sum up my main 3 points, first, the United States needs trade to promote our economic interests. Second, we need trade agreements to promote our economic and strategic interests, including countering China's coercion. And third, we need to get back in the business of negotiating trade agreements in the critical Indo-Pacific region. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Hausman, you are recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The United Steelworkers, or USW, is the largest manufacturing union in North America, and our members mine and make everything from aluminum to zinc. Our union has highlighted for over 20 years concerns for U.S. workers, our local communities, and the weakening of our country's resilience caused by unfettered trade between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, or PRC. Countering the PRC's trade and investment agenda starts by ensuring the American labor movement is at the table in a tripartite collaboration with business and government. Working together, we need to ensure our democratic ideals move across the globe as much as goods on ships and planes. The challenge cannot be underestimated, and we cannot compete using classic free trade tools developed in the 1970s with a naive hope that unfettered trade would push back authoritarian governments. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and China's exports to Russia increasing by double digits last year exposed the limits of outdated trade models. Focusing on 3 broad categories, the union encourages Congress to modernize trade agreement rules, update our trade tools to better account for China's outward expansion, and at every step of the way, ensure workers across the globe have democratic rights to freedom of association and independent labor unions. Ongoing and recent trade initiatives provided building blocks for Congress to radically rework trade in a pro-worker manner. By focusing less on immediate profits and more building resilient communities, we must ensure goods and services across the globe are traded fairly. My written testimony goes into detail, but future trade initiatives will need to include items like the USMCA, added in USMCA, like the labor value content provisions and the rapid response mechanism. Future agreements should also ensure American global financing initiatives support U.S. procurement over those goods from the PRC. Other initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPAF, have significant potential to modernize and facilitate trade without having to change domestic tariff lines. The union sees the potential of the framework, but urges Congress to monitor negotiations to ensure that we are defending U.S. workers and not inadvertently exploiting foreign communities. Another initiative Congress should also approach with an open mind is the steel and aluminum global arrangement. This negotiation between the EU and the U.S. has real potential to limit state-fueled, non-market, and carbon-intensive steel and aluminum production from entering our market. Countering the PRC's trade and investment strategy will also require retooling our trade enforcement regime to address China's third country subsidies, commonly known as the Belt and Road Initiative. This includes passing legislation like the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0, introduced last Congress by Representative Sewell and Bill Johnson. It also means closely looking at the GSP program to ensure that we are not letting content from the PRC seep through GSP beneficiary countries. This committee should also focus on how to defend against market concentration of commodities by the PRC. When nearly 100 million tons of PRC-funded steel projects, the equivalent of 1 year's U.S. production, are going into Southeast Asia using carbon-intensive technology, and a new state-owned PRC entity will centralize iron ore buying to push down prices, we need to prepare tools to defend our country's modern steel industry against the PRC's market concentration. Finally, I have in my hands here a TA petition from Waynesville workers in North Carolina. The state filed this petition for over 1,000 workers because of Chinese and other country imports idling their mill. Last Congress appropriated money for the TAA program in a simple reauthorization, but a simple reauthorization by this committee would mean this petition and others for over 24,000 workers could be heard so that they can get job retraining benefits in their time of need. If we want to compete against China, it makes sense for us to provide robust job training benefits to workers negatively impacted by Chinese trade. In conclusion, the largest difference between the U.S. and the PRC trade and investment agenda are the values we put behind our country's trade and expansion efforts. Ensuring our trade initiatives do not exploit workers globally, and ensuring U.S. workers benefit from our country's trade initiatives must be at the forefront of policymakers' decisions. President Reagan recognized this in 1981 when workers in Poland rose up and fought to have their rights for an independent trade union. Congress should begin to defend American workers through proactive, pro-worker trade agenda built on fostering exports and deflecting China's market concentration in a host of goods being dumped on our shores. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thanks again to all of our panelists. Now we'll move into the question and answer session. I'll begin with that. And again, I can't thank you enough for sharing your expertise. Mr. McHarg, obviously you represent a great state, a vibrant agriculture sector. Incidentally, you live in the largest ag district in America, and grateful for your engagement. You spoke about the need to diversify our exports and identifying markets and market access, and so that we don't become too reliant on any single trading partner, and I certainly agree. And we must increase market access in the Indo-Pacific region specifically. I do worry that the administration just sees things much differently than that, unfortunately. But could you highlight some examples of markets in the Indo-Pacific region that would be great opportunities for growth in ag exports? And do you believe that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, will do enough to level the playing field for producers themselves?
Well, I think when we look at the Indo-Pacific region, I think there's tremendous opportunity, quite frankly, and when we have these conversations about just agreeing to talk about trade, I think that just really falls short versus actually looking at true trade agreements. You know, when I visit with my farming neighbors, and we're at the coffee shop and we're having conversations about trade, many of them don't really understand the dynamics of trade and how it all works. They just know that when they hear on the radio that, for instance, China is in the market and they're purchasing grain, they know that the market goes up. They also know that if there's a down day, a lot of times you'll listen to the commentaries and there'll be something related to one of our large trading partners deciding not to purchase product. So when you think about the Indo-Pacific, you think about the population base, you think about the potential growth there. We need countries like that as well to, when they talk about doing a purchase of ag products, they move the market as well. So when you think about the concept of possibly decoupling from China, within the agriculture sector, the only way that really works for me, when you think about our trade with China is $55,000 per farmer or rancher, what are we going to replace that with? And I think we need to do it with regions like the Indo-Pacific, but you think about also Africa, Kenya. We need these countries that are actually purchasing raw commodity products. So on our farm, we sell commodities. We don't actually sell a processed food. So when we sell $1 million of raw commodities, that has a huge effect that's directly related to my farm. When we say $1 million of processed food, 10% of that may be going to the ag sector. So it's really important, whoever we trade with, that in the agriculture sector, that we talk about raw commodities that's very different than some of these other trading types of products.
Okay, thank you. My next question, Mr. Greer, I appreciate you sharing your perspective, a unique and helpful perspective. The Trump administration rightly highlighted China's IP theft and forced technology transfer policies. China is also aggressively seeking to dominate global medical supply chains, as we know. In the face of this, it is deeply concerning that the Biden administration has completely undermined, in my opinion, the American innovation through the Tariffs waiver. It seems the administration is content to see the medical supply chains shift abroad because of this. And so, given your perspective, how would you say the Tariffs waiver impacts our credibility when it comes to protecting our innovative edge? And could you speak to China's ambitions in the greater medical sector?
Certainly, Mr. Smith. I'll start with your last part. China's ambitions, whether it's medical devices or pharmaceuticals or biologics or other life sciences, this is an area where they want to take over the global economy. They want to corner the market on this, not just in the manufacture, but also in the innovation of these products. And intellectual property is key to this. When I hear about a waiver of intellectual property protections, to me that sounds like the reverse of enforcement. Obviously, we're very sympathetic to the COVID-19 pandemic, and for that reason, the TRIPS agreement actually has an article built into it to allow for compulsory licensing in the event of such a pandemic, and something that should and could be used in these kinds of situations. So I think that we want to be worried about enforcing rules, using existing flexibilities, rather than trying to get rid of enforcement or weaken rules that in the end could actually benefit China.
Thank you. Mr. Duesterberg, you've extensively researched China's ambitions on the continent of Africa and its efforts to dominate global critical mineral production. Can you discuss how trade tools, including trade preference programs like AGOA and GSP, can support our efforts to counter China's influence in the region and across key supply chains?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. I think the AGOA bill could be potentially used somewhat for lowering tariffs on imported products. But really the fundamental problem with China and Africa is that they have rather skillfully come to control basic mineral production, from mining through processing through creation of final products.
What would be your recommendation moving forward then?
Well,
on
my
that?
recommendation moving forward would be to use U.S. AID in conjunction with partners in like-minded countries to encourage and help finance U.S. and allied investments in basic production in Africa. Now, the G7 last year adopted something called, I think, the Build Back Better World program, which was designed to coordinate efforts of the G7 in areas like this. To my knowledge, there hasn't been much follow-through. The Japanese have the chairmanship of the G7 this year, and I think they're meeting next month. That might be a opportunity to reinforce the need for this. But the fundamental need is really for our companies to get some assistance to be on the playing field, so to speak, in producing the raw minerals themselves.
Okay, thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Blumenauer for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the testimony. Mr. McCurdy, your notion that we're looking at a complex set of interrelationships, I think, is well taken. And the distinction between commodities and processed food in terms of the value added for Americans, I think, is very important. Mr. Greer, at some point, I would look forward to being able to entertain your ideas for more aggressive enforcement. You indicated you had a number of them. I assume your extensive work with our friend Mr. Lighthizer gives you a sense of going forward on that. And it just, I must say, just continues to drive me crazy. I was one of those people that took the Chinese representations at face value, voted to get them into the WTO. Watching now, 20 years later, they're doing this dual track, playing the developing country when it suits their purposes, is maddening. And I'm hopeful that our committee can focus on things that will make a difference to be able to hold them accountable and avoid this, this dual standard. One of the things that I'm interested in are some specific things we can do to undercut Chinese exploiting opportunities to take advantage of us. I've referenced and have put forward legislation on the de minimis loophole, where they are now importing directly over 2 million packages a day that escape any meaningful detention, no sense of defective products. I'm wondering, Mr. Hausman, you want to just elaborate for a moment from your perspective about the extent to which it would be important to close the de minimis loophole for the Chinese?
Yes, Ranking Member Blumenauer. You know, this idea of an $800 de minimis, it allows for a significant amount of direct consumer shipments of goods from, you know, everything, the most common that everyone knows is Shein, this clothing company, right? And this idea that, China, for example, has a $10 de minimis. We aren't even able to compete on the same level from here in America on a de minimis level between the two countries. And then you add into the fact that, a lot of the clothing items that Shein is producing has the potential of cotton from the Xinjiang region, where forced labor practices, and has been highlighted by the State Department, is the potential for genocide. I think that we need to really readdress this issue of an $800 de minimis with China particularly.
To say nothing about exploding bicycle batteries. There's some creative invoicing by these Chinese sources that will get the sum of money below $800. And this is an area, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can pursue. But Mr. Hausman, taking advantage of the fact that you are representing workers who are in the steel and aluminum industry, I wondered if you could just talk for a moment about the global arrangement for steel and aluminum and a path forward to be able to deal more meaningfully with this wildly disparate overproduction capacity that the Chinese have generated and remedies that you would support.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chairman. And this is, look, global steel making capacity has increased for the 4th year in a row, while utilization has shrunk globally. Okay, which means that our plants aren't operating as efficiently as they can. And in large part, this is because of China's fueling of the global steel industry. As I mentioned in my testimony, 100 million tons of new capacity is coming online in the Southeast Asian region. And it's primarily of a technology that's going to increase the carbon intensity by 3 times than its current levels in that region for steel making. Now, when you add in this idea between the EU and the US, who are the 2 largest import share markets coming in, for steel commodities coming into the market, US has dealt with like a 20 to 30% import penetration for quite a while, over a decade. This idea that we could actually set up a club to allow us to push back on non-market and carbon-intensive steelmaking products will allow our workers who have and our companies which have modernized, are playing by the rules, and recognizing that we need to reduce carbon emissions, but also push out state-powered and fueled steel production.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all our witnesses, and Mr. Greer, I got to tell you, I really miss Ambassador Lighthizer. We are active, we are engaged on this committee, and there hasn't been much active or very engaged. If there is, nobody knows about it from my standpoint. Of course, we passed USMCA, so we know we're capable. I thought we'd be lucky to get to 218 votes, and I think we got 380, very bipartisan measure. But we had a lot of momentum. I know I did a trip with Chairman Paul Ryan at the time of this committee to Asia with other members. And there was most of the countries that we met there wanted us to be active and engaged, to be a counterpunch to China. But obviously we haven't done much in terms of that either. I guess what's your thoughts as you sit back, you take a look at where we were, where we are today? What's the difference in the administration just from your expertise, from where you were sitting? I know leadership matters, and that's big, but beside that.
Sure. Well, I will say we're in a position where I think the administration has embraced certain aspects of the Trump administration's trade policy. The Section 301 tariffs are in place. There seems to be a rhetorical, at least, agreement on the challenge with China. There's been, good movement, I think, on export controls and other things. Now, at the same time, we know that in order to have a pragmatic and robust trade policy, we have to balance a variety of stakeholders, right? We have our agricultural folks, as we've heard, are very dependent on export markets, not just China, all kinds of them. And then we have folks like the steel workers who have been really severely harmed by trade agreements in the past. And so we have to balance these.
Mr. Greer, I got one other question I wanted to ask you real quick. According to the FBI estimates, China steals between 300 and 600 billion in intellectual properties, IP, from the U.S. every year. That's a staggering sum of money, and China steals it from us each and every year. Just last month, New York Times published a very lengthy article which reported how skillfully and savvy the Communist Chinese Party has become in its effort to steal our IP. I was there 20 years ago in Beijing with a business group, and it was one of the biggest issues 20 years ago, and we haven't made a hell of a lot of progress, it seems to me, in the last 20 years. What can we do to minimize that? Because that takes a lot of money away from our companies, and we lose a lot of jobs as a result of it. It's a very, very continuous big issue. What's your thoughts?
There are a couple things we can do. First, we have a phase 1 agreement in place where the Chinese have not only agreed not to do these things, which they've agreed many times before, but they've said we can enforce with that. And that doesn't necessarily have to be tariffs. Section 301 also allows fees on services, other restrictions on services. There are a variety of things you can do. The second thing is I think U.S. companies sometimes are hesitant to share this kind of information. There needs to be some kind of either requirement or ability for confidential reporting where they have to come forward to the U.S. government, but on a confidential basis so we can get a better sense of the problem and how to deal with it directly.
Mr. Goodman, let me ask you, like a lot of us, a competitor, I hate to say, I'm all for free trade, but I want it to be fair. And to me, we get played by the Chinese in a very big way. I think we export, the number I've got is 200 billion. They import 563 billion, $400 billion deficit difference. What is it, how do we get this level the playing field a little bit more, in your opinion? Because I think it's disastrous and outrageous. At the end of the day, it needs to be somewhat in the ballpark, and this is clearly, for a lot of years, 20 years, hasn't been in the ballpark. If they're not buying one thing, they need to be working with our farmers and ranchers and everybody else. So there should be some sense of fairness, and I don't see that. I haven't seen it for 20 years. What's your idea?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Congressman. We certainly have a lot of work to do to make the Chinese market more open, more rules-based, and I think we need to continue to do that work to push them towards a direction that they were in 20 years ago when we bought this bet on bringing them into the WTO of reform and opening, and we need to hold them to that approach. I also think, embedded in your question is our large dependence and other partners of China, trading partners, a huge dependence on China for just a wide range. Pretty much everything we're looking at has a China nexus. And I think part of what we're all talking about and looking at now is a way to reduce that excessive dependence while continuing to have fair and balanced trade with China.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And pursuant to committee practice, we will proceed with 2-to-1 questioning. So we'll begin that with Mr. LaHood and proceed to the other side after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses today for your valuable testimony here today. A robust trade policy is incredibly important to me and my constituents. As I think about my district, it's heavy agriculture and manufacturing whose jobs and economic success rely on opportunities to send our great American products all over the world. However, when countries don't play by the same rules and standards as everyone else, this causes problems. Non-market countries like China, who engage in malign and predatory trade and economic practices, must be held accountable. China plays the long game through coercive trade and economic agreements, pressuring countries around the world to cede to their terms for investment. I also serve on the Intelligence Committee and the new Select Committee on China, and I learn every day about the growing threats from China. And I believe the Biden administration is missing key opportunities to push back against and hold China accountable for their trade practices. The United States should be investing in substantive trade policy with partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific region to strengthen global trade policy and make it harder for China to manipulate the system. Mr. Duestenberg, I think we can all agree that China has outsized economic ambitions, but they manipulate the global economic system and multilateral institutions to get their way. It's been over 20 years since we allowed China into the WTO. In retrospect, was that a mistake? Why or why not?
Well, I was one of the few on my side of the aisle to argue against letting them in the first place. So I think it was a mistake. So what do we do now? I can agree with Mr. Jameson about possibly considering going to an annual renewal of MFN status. But I think it also is incumbent on us to think about alternative structures that exclude China. China is and a mercantilist nation. We have lots of friends. I wish we had more friends, more staunch friends, for instance, in Europe, who agree with us on things, but I do think that we should try to erect other trade agreements, and I've argued for regional agreements. We could expand NAFTA. I do still think that we should join the CPTPP. Mr. Jameson mentioned sectoral agreements. We need to have alternative structures that exclude China, because China is not a faithful enforcer of its own agreements.
Thank you. Mr. Goodman, I and many of my colleagues have expressed our concerns about IPEF, and you mentioned that, as an insufficient tool to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly because it has no enforcement mechanisms, in my view, non-market access. How would you assess from a regional perspective, IPEF as a counter or an alternative to CPTPP?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, and I agree with you. I think one of the problems with IPEF is that it is not a formal trade agreement that's going to have an enforcement mechanism, and I've seen many of these executive agreements over the years that can do useful things, but they tend to get put in a drawer and then not followed up on, and so there's no substitute for having an agreement that is approved by Congress and then has built-in enforcement mechanisms. So I think that is one of the reasons that we ought to be looking at things like CPTPP or some other arrangement that is more like a traditional formal trade agreement. Can I just, in the answer on the other question, I should have added IP and subsidies, huge issues in China, and we ought to be taking those on including working with allies, as Ambassador Lighthizer was doing with this trilateral with Japan and Europe. That kind of effort is really important in getting China to address some of these practices that we're all troubled by.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, the question that I asked Mr. Duesenberg about whether it was a mistake 20 years ago to allow China into the WTO, do you have an answer on that, yes or no, and any other comments?
The answer is yes. And I think we have data now, right? We have data. We can, at the time, like Mr. Duesenberg said, a lot of people said it was not a great idea, but went forward anyway. But now we have 23 years of data, and we can see the jobs that were lost. We can see the factories that were lost. And this isn't just fluff, right? There are economic studies from a variety of esteemed economists who have made this connection very clearly. So there's no question that it was a mistake, and it would be a mistake going forward to continue to think that we can somehow get them to change absent some kind of strong enforcement.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think most agree that what oil was to the 20th century, electrification will be to the 21st century in terms of global dominance relative to the world economy. China is 20% of the world's population. It's a $17 trillion economy. It's 19% of the world's economy. The United States is 5% of the world's population. It's a $25 trillion economy, which is 24% of the world's economy. In this new era of global economic superiority, you're either the country that controls the supply chain, or you're the country that's controlled by the country that controls the supply chain. And the title of this hearing is Countering China's Trade and Investment Agenda, Opportunities for American Leadership. You know, China cheats on their currency, they steal our intellectual property, they treat their people poorly, and they treat their environment poorly. We do have to be tougher on China, but the United States has to be tougher on ourselves about China. What do I mean by that? China was investing $1 trillion in infrastructure in Africa 15 years ago, not to help the people of Africa, but to exploit Africa to position itself to become a superior economic force. China mines or refines 68% of the world's nickel. China mines or refines 73% of the world's cobalt. China mines or refines 40% of the world's copper. And China mines and refines 59% of the lithium, which is also called white gold in the 21st century because of the emphasis on electrification. There are 200 mega battery manufacturing plants that are either online or will be completed by 2030 for electric vehicles. 11 are in North America, 21 are in Europe, and 148 are in China. China has 80% of the global lithium-ion manufacturing capacity. Not only are we being outpaced, we're getting clobbered. And unless and until Democrats and Republicans within the American government make a decision to gain access to these raw materials, we can never catch up. And we will always, in the 21st century, be controlled by the country that controls the world supply chains. So, Mr. Duesenberg, you had made reference to this relative to rare earth materials and minerals. Your thoughts on this?
Well, it's not as if we don't have natural resources in the United States and in our countries that are very friendly to us, Canada and Australia especially. The mistake we've made, I mean, China has been very aggressive about capturing these various resources. They put a huge amount of capital investment into this, not only in Africa, but in Latin America. And they're actually buying lithium mines in Canada these days. We've been somewhat asleep at the switch and allowed subsidized Chinese industry to take over these industries. We can and should start to exploit the resources that we and our allies in friendly countries have. We've started this in rare earths. We have a new mine, the old Mountain Pass mine is up and running. We're working with Australia. We could do this on uranium if we're ever going to reinvigorate the nuclear
Yeah, my time is
power.
almost up. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me just say this to you. There are 17 mines in Africa that mined rare earth minerals and metals. 15 of the 17 in South Africa, Congo, Mozambique, are either owned or controlled by China. 17 of 15. Now, there are mines throughout the world, I understand that, but at least we have to acknowledge that we are considerably behind. You can't just flip a switch and be ready to compete with what another country has done with its resources, regardless of how they've accumulated those resources 15 years ago. Because what Africa is rich with is precious metals and minerals, and they're way ahead of us. And I'm just simply underscoring the need for America to be more aggressive in their competition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Arrington from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses, I want to follow on some of the comments and thought process from Mr. Higgins, my friend, with respect to China and this very interesting, I have a hard time describing, quite frankly, the relationship we have with them. I come from one of the world's largest agriculture production centers, oil and gas, energy in general. I know how big and seductive their market is, but I've just got a few questions to sort this out in my head. I just seem to always be perplexed by this conundrum. Mr. Goodman, is China one of the worst human rights violators in the world community?
China's human rights are atrocious.
Atrocious. Does China steal our intellectual property, as has been reported, force some of these transfer agreements, et cetera? Do they steal our intellectual property?
Yes, that's been a central part of their development strategy.
Do they spy on Americans?
Yes.
Do they align with other malign actors, other countries that don't share our values and would probably be considered adversaries of the United States and our allies around the world?
Yes.
Do you think China is our greatest adversarial threat?
I think there's no question it's our biggest competitor and challenger, and in some cases an adversary that we could become enmeshed in serious problems with. And so it's it's a generational challenge.
Are they a partner?
Not right now, but we do depend on them. The reality is we depend on their market. We depend on their inputs for, as I mentioned, everything we're looking at has some China nexus. And we do need to talk to them, in part to avoid any miscalculation, misunderstanding, but also to talk about issues that affect everybody, pandemics, environmental challenges, terrorism, proliferation. There are many issues that we need to talk to them about.
It seems to be quite a precarious situation to answer the first set of questions in the way I would have answered them as well, and I suspect most of the panel would have answered. And then when asked about their partnership, the response was, well, we need them. I'd say maybe the greatest challenge for one of the greatest challenges for our country not just this committee, is to need China less until China changes its behavior. If that's possible, we thought it would be possible when we welcomed them to the World Trade Organization table. Mr. Greer, I was very impressed with Mr. Lighthizer and you and your team. I believe my Democrat colleagues are every bit as interested in continuing the good work we did with USMCA and having this free trade framework that we can then take throughout the world. We need to enforce it, and we need to replicate it, especially in the Indo-Pacific area, as has been discussed. But it seems like the missing piece is having a president that is very assertive and has made this issue of trade a priority. When it comes to negotiating with China, I think we were all pretty stunned that we were able to get to these purchase agreements and these structural reforms like phase one. What is the psychology of negotiating with China? Just for the benefit of this committee, if the president were listening, how do we approach China to best undo some of the things we need to undo in terms of supply chain dependence, and then forge forward with enforcing some of the agreements we have and then beyond? And then I yield back after your response.
We have a saying in the United States where good fences make good neighbors, and I don't know if we'll ever be good neighbors with China, but we found that they really respected strong action and not as much hot rhetoric, right? I mean, I think sometimes we get those reversed. I think sometimes we pound our fist and decry things that deserve to be decried, but then we don't take action. I think actually the reverse works a lot better with the Chinese, is to be polite, be respectful, talk to them, consult with them, and take really strong action. They did not think that we were going to impose tariffs on them, and then we did. And then they didn't think we were going to do it again, and then we did. And then they came to the table.
Thank you. Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. You know, when it comes to China, there's a lot of bipartisan support for holding the Chinese Communist Party accountable and tackling their sinister advancement into other nations around the globe. So as this committee discusses ways in which we can compete with the CCP, being competitive in our own tax code is one way to ensure the United States is positioned as a global leader and pushes back on our adversaries. This is especially true when it comes to research and development. According to the R&D Coalition, the U.S. share of global R&D investments in 2019 was 30%, down from 33% in 2009 and 40% in 1999. Unlike the United States, China's global share of R&D investment has gone up. It was 24% in 2019, a big jump from 5% in 2000 and 15% in 2009. That means China's R&D investments have increased by 400% in just 2 decades. And what did they do to incentivize R&D? China's implemented a deduction of up to 200% on eligible R&D investments. And without actions to undo the U.S. research and development amortization tax provision that kicked in last year, China go from having 2.5 times more favorable tax benefits for research and development to as high as 20 times more favorable than the United States. Research and development is critical for our competitive, yet without the right incentives, the United States is ceding research and development and in turn jobs to the Chinese Communist Party. But today, on tax day, my colleagues and I are introducing much needed legislation to fix the R&D tax code that when passed will provide greater economic opportunities and reduce our dependence on foreign adversaries. The American Innovation and R&D Competitiveness Act allows for immediate expensing of eligible R&D costs, bringing us back to where we were just 2 years ago, and securing our dominance in research and development. Legislation is a bipartisan solution that I've introduced by my Ways and Means colleague, Congressman John Larson of Connecticut, as well as several Republicans and Democrat colleagues on the Trade Subcommittee today. Mr. Duesterberg, do you agree that having China continue advanced research and development while the United States slows R&D harms our economy and American workers? And is there a correlation between where R&D occurs and where jobs and manufacturing follows?
Congressman, I do agree with the sentiment, and I agree with the need for your bill. I agree that R&D does produce results in terms of manufacturing and jobs especially, but I would just caution people to not overestimate the efficiency of Chinese research and development and their scientific research. I think we're much better at that than they are. I would also note that it would be useful, I think, to continue the trend towards more support for basic research and development. Most Chinese research is in the area of development. We are still world leaders, and the benefits that we received for instance, in the 1950s and the 1960s, when we were buying far and away the world leader in basic research, paid rich dividends in terms of manufacturing things like semiconductors, aerospace technology for many years to come. So I would also emphasize, in addition to the R&D tax credit, the need to continue robust support for basic research in the United States.
And yeah, there's always that trade-off between basic research and applied research and application. So, in addition to talking about research and development, we know China has been stealing American innovation and technology, and now the Biden administration is working to give away our vaccine innovation through the WTO Tariffs waivers. Mr. Greer, you mentioned earlier talking about our intellectual property. What are some more concerns, or do you have anything else to add to, and particularly your assessment of the Biden administration's stance on waivers and support for U.S. intellectual property?
Certainly, Congressman. With respect to intellectual property generally, you'll recall that intellectual property was actually at the heart of the Section 301 investigation that gave rise to the current tariff regime on China. So that was something where everyone agreed that this was a problem and we should deal with it. With respect to now with the proposed waiver, which I mentioned before, we have existing tools to deal with pandemic-style needs, and moreover, I think rich countries, the quickest, if we have an issue with vaccination, the quickest way is for rich countries to donate and get the vaccine to the countries, right? Thinking that we can parachute IP for free into a less developed country and a vaccine facility is going to spring up there, I mean, that just doesn't make a lot of economic sense. So I think we need to think of other tools to help these countries.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, I'll recognize Mr. Panetta for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Mr. Goodman, let me talk to you real quick. Your organization has provided a number of examples how China seeks to use economic coercion to control its trading partners that can impact small countries and our allies as well. It's boycotted Korean automakers over missile defense agreements with the United States, blockaded Norwegian goods over Nobel Peace Prize awardees, and cut off infrastructure investments in Mongolia based on a visit by the Dalai Lama. In some cases, especially for smaller countries, the coercion works. However, you also note that these moves can backfire, causing more distrust of China. A couple questions here. In what ways can economic coercion have unintended consequences for China? What can we do to capitalize off of these blunders? And what are some of the ways in which we can increase the resilience of those countries that are so vulnerable to China's economic coercion?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. And yes, we looked at all this in this report that we put out a few weeks ago and concluded that a lot of times China is trying to do something in the short term tactically to get somebody to take a sign off a door or not have a particular person visit their capital, and they don't even succeed at that level often. But certainly this longer-term strategic effect that you're referencing tends to drive partners away. And I would say, the Korean government has leaned into us. You could draw a straight line from the coercion of Australia, the blocking of their coal, their wine, their lobster, to the AUKUS agreement, the Australia, UK, US agreement. I think that was the result of this. It was largely, at least, pushed hard by this coercion. So I think there's no question that China is its own worst enemy when it comes to this coercion, and we should find a way to take advantage of that. And the answer that we came up with was, to your other point, building resilience, helping our partners be less vulnerable and less subject to that kind of coercion from China, and to show them that we're a more trusted partner, both economically and strategically.
Great, thank you. Mr. Greer, you suggested that Congress consider ending PNTR with China, given their history of unfair trade practices and non-market behaviors. Obviously, we got a lot of issues with China, but I'm concerned we've seen how this can play out. And what I mean is, I know there's support for the Phase 1 agreement with China, but I would note that despite some agricultural reforms, China has not taken meaningful action on agricultural biotechnology and required risk assessments for beef and pork. Now, you note that revoking PNTR will give us time to review China's status and put the onus on China to decide if it will change its ways or not. But given the history of our 301 tariffs, don't you think that this strategy will be successful? Do you think it will be successful? And why do we still have 301 tariffs? And why haven't those tariffs changed China's behavior enough to be rescinded?
Yes, Mr. Congressman, I think everything we've heard today has really sharpened that we have a very unhealthy dependence on China. When you look at the Section 301 tariffs, our imports from China with respect to those items on which the tariffs are subject have decreased substantially. So we are now less dependent on China for those items. That's the kind of direction that we want to go in. You're exactly right that we want to worry about retaliation and things like that. It's not an easy answer, and I don't want to suggest that it is, but I think we need to make sure our exporters and agricultural folks are taken care of and that we are able to maintain that balance that's needed.
All right. Now, Mr. Goodman, what are your thoughts on revoking PNTR, and what impacts do you think it'd have on the U.S. economy?
I mean, I think this is a very complex issue because we are so dependent on China on the export and import side. And I think if what you're suggesting ultimately is a kind of a broader decoupling, I think that would be very costly for us. I think what we need to be doing is focusing on targeted areas where we have real risks and threats. That's why I think that the October 7th measures on advanced semiconductor and equipment were appropriate, because we were trying to really effectively decouple and degrade China's capability. I think that's the approach we should be taking, is trying to find areas where we have specific risks and threats and finding ways to mitigate those.
Thanks. Mr. Mahargu, just real quickly, sorry, I'm giving you a little bit of time. What SPS challenges are you facing specifically in China? What SPS challenges are facing specifically in Nebraska with China and other countries that we could diversify our export markets?
Rotopamine is one of the products that we think that is completely safe, that's usable, that we are not using right now. I think that's one example.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, I'll recognize Ms. Miller from West Virginia.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you all for being here today. Last month, a bipartisan group of my colleagues visited Mexico, Ecuador, and Guyana to learn more about the trade challenges and other issues that are facing our bilateral relationships in Latin America. The one issue that came up in each of these countries is the rise of China's Communist Party's influence throughout the region. When Ambassador Tai testified in front of our committee, I told her that the CCP is outmaneuvering us when it comes to trade deals in the Indo-Pacific, as well as our neighbors in our own hemisphere. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is failing to react strategically and successfully challenge the growing Chinese influence across the globe. That's why I've been diligently working in Congress with my Ways and Means colleagues to develop policy solutions that will press the administration into action. We're working on redeveloping the U.S. trade leadership in the Indo-Pacific Act to put America back in the driver's seat in regional trade deals in Asia. I'm a lead sponsor of the Made in America Act, which will reshore pharmaceutical supply chains from China to opportunity zones in the United States. With these policies and many more, it is clear that the Republican majority is ready to act. Now we need President Biden to step up and deliver for the American people. Mr. Goodman, I'm concerned major trade deals in the Indo-Pacific, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the CPTPP, are putting U.S. exports, businesses, and workers at a major disadvantage. Both of these agreements are phasing in tariff cuts throughout the region, proving that every year the U.S. does not negotiate a real trade agreement, that we are falling farther and farther behind. Do you think IPEF goes far enough to help the United States compete economically with countries like China in the Indo-Pacific? And if not, what would you recommend we do better to compete?
Thank you, Madam Congresswoman, and I agree with your analysis that I think we are losing ground, and an agreement like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is diverting trade away from us and towards China, other countries in the region, and so we need to be back in this game. I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework has some promise. It's good 13 countries have joined us. The agenda is not bad, and if these discussions can lead to kind of be the tributary for us to get back into the major river of major formal trade agreements. In other words, they can develop the standards and the best practices that could then feed into an updated regional trade agreement. Then I think it could be useful. But in and of itself, as an executive agreement that is not going to have enforcement mechanisms, it's not going to have the incentives for our partners to want to aspire to these higher standards that we're seeking, I'm concerned it's not going to be enough. So we need to think about it as a way to feed into a formal trade agreement.
That's a nice way to put it, but it's still just a polite suggestion. Mr. Greer, on our trip to Latin America, we learned the region is ripe for American leadership. Central America, in particular, can play a key role in countering China's trade and investment agenda. While I support CAFTA, I'm disappointed with the lack of growth under the agreement. The apparel trade has steadily declined over the life of CAFTA, while apparel imports from China have doubled, proving that CAFTA has left some sectors uncompetitive. What can we do to make apparel supply chains in the Western Hemisphere more competitive and resilient? And how can we support more growth and job creation in the region?
Congresswoman, as you mentioned, we already have a series of strong FTAs in the region. You could have a situation where you upgrade some of these agreements, like with CAFTA. Perhaps you can modernize it and add on new chapters. You know, I know I sound like a broken record, but with Section 301, we put tariffs on China, actually giving preferential tariff treatment to all other kinds of partners relative to China, who's their major competitor. So they should be poised to take advantage of that. They should be poised to take advantage of this preferential tariff treatment relative to China, take advantage of CAFTA, and look at modernizing it as you might suggest.
On a different topic this week, a video from a country called JA Solar leaked where the chief financial officer openly bragged to potential American investors that the company was essentially port shopping to evade the groundbreaking human rights law that was signed into law in 2021, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That bill was designed to ensure strict enforcement of our existing ban on imports made with forced labor, including the systematic use of ethnic minorities for slave labor. In my home state of West Virginia, we have a Customs and Border Patrol Advanced Training Center, and I would hope that preparing to enforce our forced labor law would be a priority at the facility. Do you have any sense of whether the CBP or other U.S. law enforcement agencies have the training and resources to ensure compliance with this law?
Well, I could say that they certainly are moving forward on it. I'm in the private sector, and I hear from companies very frequently that they are trying to come into compliance. I think CBP could use additional resources for enforcement. I think it would also benefit the trade to have a better sense of what CBP expects with respect to proving up that you're in compliance and having some kind of a safe harbor where you can actually actively go in and say, here's where I am, here's everything I'm doing, I'm trying to do the right thing under the law, can you please work with me? I think that would be helpful to CBP.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for being here for what I think has been a really great discussion with a lot of consensus on where we stand with China, the potential threats of China, certainly their goals and what they want to see us accomplish. I do want to go back to some of the discussions the questions that Mr. Panetta had asked in regards to PNTS. And Mr. Greer, I think he asked you this question. You've advocated for revoking PNTR completely. I guess I'd like to understand that a little more. Certainly, we want to counter China in every way we can, but fact of the matter is they're still also one of our largest trading partners. Someone else, I think, had mentioned how complicated the issue is because we have American businesses who rely on China for a market for their products, and we certainly still receive a lot of goods as well. So can you explain to me what you mean by revoking PNTR? Are you looking for a complete decoupling of trade with China at some point, or what's the practicality of revoking PNTR?
So it's hard to imagine a world where we're completely decoupled from China, absent some significant geopolitical event. But before China had PNTR, they were subject to an annual certification under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, where you, Congress, and the President together, if I recall correctly, had to decide whether or not, it was Congress, you had to decide whether or not China was going to continue to receive most favored nation treatment. And so going back to that situation where China no longer benefits from complete certainty all the time, that brings an element of discipline. Before 2000, before PNTR was granted, we didn't have manufacturers going over to China as much and putting their factories there and exporting back here because they didn't know that they would always have certainty of access to this market. Going back to that situation would discipline the Chinese. It wouldn't raise the tariffs right away. It would put in your hands to decide on a yearly basis whether you, Congress, think that we should continue to have normal trade relations with China.
Have you looked, and again, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, just trying to evaluate whether that makes sense. Have you looked at the domestic economic impact, for instance? What impact would it have on the business community and on U.S. jobs?
So if you went back to a Jackson-Vanik style yearly amendment, nothing would happen unless you decided, okay? So if you say we're going to go back to a yearly certification, nothing immediately happens to those tariffs. You're still in a situation where you're under control. What happens is you get leverage. The problem we've always had with whether it's China or our other trading partners is you, Congress, you've given away a lot of the tariffs over years for a lot of different reasons, good or bad, and you've lost some of that leverage. If you go back to this situation where China on a yearly basis has to yearly get an approval to continue to have the same tariff regime they're enjoying, 301 aside, that gives you leverage with China to try to get the kind of market access behavior that we would want without immediately raising all those tariffs, and you can have that in your pocket if you need to.
Thank you. I've also a slightly different question, but somewhat related, of course. But I've heard the comment rules-based system, and I think part of the problem with China is that they choose not to follow the rules that are generally followed internationally. And we have trade tools that are available to us that can be used to counter that, but in many cases, the Biden administration's decision to abandon those tools have left us with very little. And instead, in some ways, the administration has chosen to mimic China's aggressive economic subsidies to promote domestic production. And maybe, Mr. Duesterberg, I'll ask you the question, does that work? What message does that approach send to our allies? Do you think that these actions may encourage our trading partners to abandon a rules-based system of trade?
Well, it's the adoption of what in effect is a targeted industrial policy in the United States has had a couple of impacts. One of them is that our friends, and I keep saying our friends, hoping that the Europeans remain our friends with regard to actions on China, but it's stimulated a sort of a competitive industrial policy. They're going to adopt subsidies for their green industries and other industries. Japan has adopted a subsidy regime to try to get their own companies into the game. So another impact of that is that our credibility in trying to gain WTO reform on the subsidy code is really shot to pieces because we're doing what we are trying to get China and have been trying to get China to do or to renounce for 2 decades. So all in all, it's a problem. China is not going to change its behavior, and so that's why I've advocated trying to create alternative rules-based agreements that basically exclude China.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Breyer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for putting this on. And I've really enjoyed the testimony and learned a great deal from it. And Mr. Goodman, I truly appreciated your testimony where you discussed the importance of U.S. economic engagement trade with our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific. Your explanation of the motivations behind TPP, that it was intended to strengthen the existing alliances in a key region, help build new relationships, echoes my own belief that withdrawing from the TPP was one of the enormous strategic mistakes of the last 20 years and a mistake that we will pay for years to come, particularly in the context of the Chinese efforts to economically dominate the region. You mentioned that the successor to TPP, CPTPP, is continuing to evolve. China's applied to it. Assuming that our trade ambitions don't grow beyond the IPAF and China enters the CPTPP, what should we expect the consequences to be? And please describe how China could take advantage of writing the rules of the road, something that should be our responsibility.
Well, again, I couldn't agree more with your analysis, Mr. Congressman. I think it was a catastrophic mistake to pull out of TPP, and I think it would be an even greater catastrophe if China were in CPTPP and we weren't in anything over there. So I think, our allies, Japan, Australia, and others who are in CPTPP are going to hold off China's application as long as possible, but at some point, I think they're going to have to entertain that, especially now the UK seems likely to join. And so I think it's not unrealistic to think that 2-3 years from now, China could be on the road to acceding to CPTPP, which would be just devastating to our interests because they would be in there trying to shape and probably undermine some of the good rules that are in TPP. And so we need to have something, and that's why I just feel it's so important for us to use IPEF as a way to get back into something higher standard. And I just throw out here, which is probably risky for me to do, but since you all, in a very bipartisan support, with bipartisan support, passed the USMCA not 3 years ago, it seems to me that could be, I know it's got unique elements to it, but that's a sort of tested model of a trade agreement that maybe could be updated, built on, expanded in the region if that's our more comfortable approach than going back to this TPP.
And thank you for bringing up USMCA, because I never tire of pointing out that USMCA, which was bipartisan, celebrated, one of the major achievements of the last number of years during the Trump administration, 80% of it has showed up was directly taken word for word from TPP. Mr. Hausman, in your testimony, you mentioned how U.S. and Canadian production of minerals, critical for the manufacture of EVs, isn't nearly sufficient if we're going to compete with China in the future. Now, we know the administration is pursuing a number of side agreements, and I appreciate the intent of the agreements. We don't like that Congress is left out. But are you concerned about the relative weakness in terms of environmental and labor protections?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, for USW, the importance here for critical minerals is that how we mine and process those materials. Right now, in Indonesia, where China has invested $16 billion in nickel processing, the environmental degradation there is extreme. Annually, 1,400 workers are injured there and 5 are being killed, but according to Indonesian unions there. Is that really the type of trade agreement or trade arrangement that we want to set up with our trading partners, where we're exploiting workers and allowing them to be killed? Like, this is the kind of system that we need to set up. And this is why I'm so concerned about when we talk about the rules of origin. In the TPP, for example, up to 65% of a vehicle could have been made with Chinese content and shipped into the US market because we only had a 35% rule of origin standard in the TPP. That's one of the reasons why the United Steelworkers opposed the agreement. The idea of how our trade rules are set up to ensure that we have standards and the ability of enforcing those standards and ensuring that the rules of origin are set as a way to our American goods are going to be prioritized in the manufacture and distribution so that our members, union members, and also workers across all of non-union or non-union can benefit. And I think those are the reasons why, we look at when we have, for example, in cobalt, where USW has miners up in Canada and have worked with a facility here in North Dakota. There's nearly 80% of the world's cobalt is processed in China. And they're able to effectively swamp the market. They actually stopped a cobalt mine here in Idaho, in part by just dumping into the market and depressing the price so much that this Idaho project couldn't move forward. So there are opportunities here, but we're going to have to invest, which I think you're kind of hearing here a bit, is this idea that we need to actually provide a bit of fiscal support and the protections necessary to allow private firms to develop their mines.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming today. It's obviously a huge issue for us in this country. It's obviously clear that China is trying to dominate the world. Belt and Road Initiative, economic coercion, predatory trade practices, espionage, balloons, police stations. We can go on and on and on. All wars are not kinetic. And it's obviously that this is a war of attrition, if you were, as far as trade goes. America's suffering because of it. The farmers, manufacturers are being cheated. 2018, Commerce Department found under 2 separate cases that Chinese exporters had significantly undersold and subsidized cast iron soil pipe and cast iron fittings in the United States. 1. In the same time, AD-CVD duties were being imposed to counteract China's unfair trade practices, but U.S. businesses had to devote extensive time, money, resources toward remedies under U.S. trade laws that are still supposed to be designed to hold those accountable. And even when relief is granted, China and other trade partners commonly engage in evasive tactics to avoid penalties. They just move around. It's whack-a-mole. And we're losing the global contest at the expense of U.S. taxpayers. So let me just shift to the China solar issue just for a minute. In spite of all that we've discussed, and I'm sure that the Biden administration is cognizant of what's going on, the President issued an emergency declaration to allow imports of unfairly traded solar products from China into the U.S. with no additional tariffs for 2 years. That hadn't been done since 1946 when President Truman brought in wood so we could build houses after World War II. Mr. Greer, I'm an original co-sponsor of the bipartisan resolution of disapproval, which would reverse the administration's emergency declaration that suspends these tariffs on Chinese solar products that are circumventing U.S. trade laws through 4 other countries. Given that we have all said today, can you help me understand why we would embolden China to destroy American jobs and cheat American manufacturers?
I can't help you understand that because it doesn't make sense to me either. And I think that we need to make sure that our domestic producers in any kind of sector need to have the certainty that when they get trade relief through trade remedies, they can count on it.
It's just unconscionable. We are literally selling ourselves out while we know we're selling ourselves out. Let me ask you one other question. Chinese domestic consumption is pretty weak compared for a modern economy, and its internal market consumes a surprisingly small share of the goods that it produces. It has relied on the U.S. consumers for growth in its export-oriented growth strategy. In other words, we're the ones paying and their own people are not buying. The U.S. is by far China's biggest export market. No other country has expressed a willingness or ability to absorb China's subsidized forced labor overproduction. Are we funding China's economic and military growth?
There's no question about that, sir. Again, it's something that to me seems unbelievable that we're doing. I think we'll always have some kind of trade with China, but we have to manage it. It has to be in the appropriate sectors. It has to be balanced. We have these gross, persistent trade deficits. We are funding our strategic adversary.
Absolutely. And I don't care Republican, Democrat, we're asleep at the wheel, and it's staring us right in the face. So if we repealed most favored nation status and increasingly deny China our market to fund their growth, specifically military growth, wouldn't China's growth slow and stagnate?
It could. We have a global market, and they may find other ways to dump all of their stuff. But we are, as you I like to call us, we're the consumer of last resort. That's what we are. And so I think that we could help control that relationship if we change our approach.
President Reagan's strategy to win the Cold War was not military. It was economic. And this is exactly what we did to Russia, is we starved them economically. And I would submit to my Republican colleagues and my Democratic colleagues that we wake up and we begin the same thing, because if not, we're going to wake up very, very soon and either be speaking Mandarin or have every economy of ours devoted to China. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Next to Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We need a worker-focused trade policy, not a corporate price-centered one. And we need to take every step necessary to achieve balanced trade and eliminate the trade deficits that are bleeding our economy to death. We should use tariffs strategically to stop unfair trade in our market and to ensure the elimination of trade deficits. We've been running deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars year in and year out for decades. These trillions of dollars come back in the form of foreigners owning American assets permanently. The United States net international investment is an astonishing negative $16 trillion. Foreigners own $16 trillion more here than we do around the world. Foreigners, including China, own these assets and the future income from these assets. China has engaged in economic aggression against the United States for years. It has a mercantilist policy designed to build its economy at the expense of others, including ours, using a largely closed market and massive subsidies. It has stolen our technology, manipulated its currency, infiltrated our infrastructure, hacked our businesses and personal databases, engaged in cyber attacks on our private and governmental systems, undertaken espionage against our businesses and our government. China accounts for 80% of all counterfeits coming into America, and their IP theft alone has been estimated to cost us $300 billion annually. In short, China has conducted economic warfare on us and the West and has done it for decades, and we are losing because of Biden's trade policies. As a result of our own foolish trade policies of the past, we have lost millions of jobs and much of our technology leadership and have transferred trillions of dollars to China. These huge annual trade deficits have built their military and developed their industry and technology at our expense. Their economy has grown from about $1.2 trillion in 2000, when ours was $10 trillion, to about $16 trillion now, when ours is about $22 trillion. In this period, our cumulative trade deficits and goods with them has amounted to more than $6 trillion. The United States has not faced a foe with economic power this close to our own in over 130 years. Our trade and economic integration must be balanced and on terms that help America and our workers, not China. We should not link our technology sectors with China, and we should have no trade or industrial cooperation in the security or joint use technology sectors, period. We need to limit Chinese investment in the U.S. economy and to regulate outward investment to China. We should put tariffs on all products imported from China until we achieve balanced trade, and we must insist that they buy our products if they want access to our markets. In the remaining time I have, Mr. Greer, if there's anything that I stated that you would like to expand upon, I will yield my remainder time to you.
Certainly, I'm happy to do that, and I think that your policy prescriptions are things that we need to strongly consider. Coupled with Dr. Murphy's comments, policy prescriptions for dealing with China depend on what you think about the threat. So if our premise is China is a threat, they're a generational challenge, we think that they are preparing for military conflict with their neighbors or heaven forbid, even us. If that's the case, then we need to be thinking about our trade relationship in a way that strengthens our manufacturing and defense industrial base, maybe at almost any cost. If you think that that threat is overblown or you think that people are being alarmist, then your ideas on what the policy prescriptions are going to be will be different. So I think we need to have a conversation about that. I fall in the first camp that I'm concerned that we're on a knife edge right now and that we need to make sure our trade policy reflects that. But I think we need to talk to China. I think we need to be clear with them. I think we need to set ground rules. I think we need to do enforcement so that we can avoid that kind of situation, that we can have a strong base. The strongest thing we can do for our allies is have a strong industrial base here in the United States and be the arsenal of democracy. We can't do that if we're sending our manufacturing overseas.
Agree with you 100%, and I think COVID taught us that when we were struggling to get products in from all over the world to solve some of those industrial problems. And it's time, we're in an economic war with China and we are losing, and we have been losing, and it's time for us to change the trade policy to an America First agenda to focus on America products and ensure that we're focusing on the safety and security of the American people first and China last. Thank you for your time. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, recognize Ms. Sanchez. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member Blumenauer. I just want to remind my colleagues that many of us worked hard to pass strong trade legislation in competes last year that would have confronted China's unfair trade practices. House Democrats led on competes, the CHIPS Act, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Unfortunately, Republicans chose not to join us across the board on those pieces of legislation. The conversation, it seems to me, needs to be about competition. We're trying to slow China down, but instead we need to focus on speeding ourselves up and continuing to look ahead to ways in which we can stay competitive in various industries. Mr. Hausman, in your testimony, you briefly discussed the importance of ensuring air, water, and labor standards are considered and measured in anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations. And I agree that American workers and their employers should not have to compete against countries like China that enable environmental degradation and forced labor. Could you elaborate on why it's crucial to level the playing field for American workers and industries regarding other countries' labor and environmental practices? And do you have an example of how considering these factors would play out in anti-dumping or countervailing duties investigations?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Ms. Sanchez, Representative Sanchez. 75% of Vietnam's industrial wastewater isn't treated. The idea that we passed the Clean Water Act so that I can go fishing in Montana, where I used to work at a paper mill, and not see the discharge out from the mill and know that it is clean, versus in Vietnam right now, people's water, or Indonesia, where they're, we're talking about nickel mining, and literally the waterways and the fishing in the local communities there has been completely degraded and eroded. Like, this idea that that nickel is then being processed and then sent to the United States for further processing is, come at the expense of U.S. furnaces in Pennsylvania. This idea that we shouldn't be able to countervail against this sort of built-in process. These are not like products. If you have a steel beam, one made with high carbon, no concern to environmental standards and killing workers versus U.S. standards, we should be able to account for that economic cost. Those aren't like products. And so, that's one of the reasons why the USW has been really out there and pushing on this idea and we can account for it. I mean, literally, we send inspectors to look at tomatoes in Mexico to make sure that they're abiding by health FDA standards.
Appreciate the answer. Mr. Goodman, Mr. Greer has recommended that the U.S. should revoke permanent normal trade relations with China, and this is building on the questions that Mr. Panetta and Mr. Smucker asked earlier. Experts maintain that the tools we have to address these issues are limited when dealing with a country, let's be honest, that lacks transparency or doesn't adhere to a rules-based trading system. But other people talk about the disruption that PNTR would have on the global economy if we were to repeal it. Can you share your perspectives on revoking PNTR and the alternatives that we might have to address the challenges posed by China while still protecting good-paying American jobs?
Well, as you captured in your question, Madam Congresswoman, this is a very complicated issue because it's easy to understand why there would be an argument for not having a kind of normal trade relationship with a country with these practices. But on the other hand, the reality is we do have this complex and large relationship, and it would be the fact is it would be very disruptive if we move sharply away from that. But there are things we can do, I think, both to deal with specific risks, as I say, where we can use targeted efforts like these semiconductor controls, which I think were appropriate, or working with allies. As I mentioned, Ambassador Lighthizer, when he was U.S. Trade Representative, organized this trilateral grouping on industrial policies, on China's industrial policies and IP and other issues. And I think we should revive that and be working with allies to try to push China on those issues. But finally, I think at the end of the day, it comes back to China's going to be China. We have to do the stuff that we have to do, invest in ourselves. We have to have a trade policy that makes us competitive and advances our economic and strategic interests. So I think that's where I would put most of our focus, but there are things we need to do that are targeted to deal with the China risks.
Appreciate your answers, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Fischbach is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to focus on a little bit. Mr. McHarg, I appreciate your comments and your testimony regarding the nuanced relationship between Nebraska agriculture, the Chinese market, and the broader geopolitical dynamics. Agriculture in my state currently has a very similar relationship. I'm from Minnesota, heavily ag district, exporting roughly $1.5 billion of ag product every year and representing a market for nearly a quarter of our ag exports. This competitor-customer dynamic is important to consider given national security concerns and other larger factors beyond agricultural exports. With that in mind, can you share your perspective of the appropriate balance between expanding the Chinese market access and diversifying ag export opportunities through additional trade agreements?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that question because it really gets at the heart of a lot of this discussion we're actually having this afternoon. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the ways that we can help that conversation is by continuing to establish other markets. And so then it's not quite as much about China, and it's more about how do we, as America, an agricultural powerhouse in the world, continue to sell our products that we do so well. And one of the things that we do really well is producing, I would say, probably one of the lowest carbon footprint ag products in the world, and we need to develop those other countries. But I think with China, as I have those conversations and I think about the people that I do business with, even in my hometown, it's still important that we do business with people that need our product. It's very clear that China is growing in their need for grains. Just this last year, they became one of the largest grain importers in the world. So that indicates to me that they're going to continue to need our products. And so I think that gives us the leverage, quite frankly, to have some of these conversations that we're having here this afternoon. If they don't need our products and we don't have the ability to trade with them, I think we lose a lot of that leverage to actually deal with some of the things that we've talked about today.
And Mr. McHarg, maybe as kind of a follow-up, but in terms of opportunity cost, what does the Biden administration's lack of negotiations mean to you, your members, at the farm level?
Yeah. Again, we do such a good job producing our products, and if we don't have the world out there, I think we do actually have the world out there that needs it. But every single day that goes by, I think we are at a disadvantage. And so to keep the U.S. In the position that we are in, I would say every day that this administration is not working on trade is the day that we are losing.
Thank you very much. And maybe I will just throw this out with my last minute and a half for Mr. Duesenberg or for Mr. Greer. How do we appropriately balance these factors with the broader national security concerns of an increasingly aggressive Chinese economic agenda? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, it's awfully clear that China has benefited from acquisition of U.S. technology, and much of what they have done in terms of developing an advanced military capabilities has been at the expense of U.S. producers, but also it's a result in some part of Chinese ability to access American technology and know-how through access to the American academic system. They send 300,000 or 400,000 students over here. They Some of them work in industry. They return to China. They bring secrets of one sort or another with them. So I don't know what the solution to that is. We need to reflect on that, but certainly America has been crucial in China's development of an advanced military system, and we have to find ways to selectively at least stop investments, stop their ability to be in programs that are directly related to military technology. And I would also suggest to anything associated with Chinese exports of their authoritarian state surveillance technology and the like.
Well, thank you very much, and my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kustoff is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening today's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Greer, thank you also for appearing and for your former public service. If I can to you, I'd like to talk about intellectual property theft, and I know that other people, including Congressman Buchanan, have talked about that and talked about the study that showed that Chinese IP theft has cost our country anywhere from $225 billion to $600 billion a year. And I know that's a big span, and those numbers are a little expansive, but the fact of the matter is it's substantial. If I can, Tennessee is home to one of the last manufacturers of charcoal barbecue grills in the U.S., the Mako Corporation, M-E-C-O. Now, about 20 years ago, Mako employed about 900 Tennesseans. That number's down to about 200 at the same factory today. And that's because China has used IP theft to unfairly capture most of the domestic charcoal grill market, importing grills that are virtually identical to the grill that Mako had patented. If I can, I want to show you this poster. The top, if you can see up there, is Mako's grill, and that grill hit the market in 1999 under patent. The below grill is a Chinese knockoff, and that showed up in the market in 2018 when the Mako grill was still under patent. The model, the coloring, the design, they're all the same. In fact, the two grills are really indistinguishable from one another. There's also evidence of Mako's grills being used for presentation in China showrooms. And the Mako's grill photography was used by a competitor to sell knockoff grills on Alibaba. And the Mako grill photography being used in Chinese factory catalogs. We all know that this situation with Mako is not unique. So my question, in your written testimony, you talk about this 2018 report that USTR did, and I assume you were there in 2018 as Chief of Staff. If you were still there today, based on the report, and assuming that what I've represented to you is correct, which it is, what tools in the arsenals at USTR would you propose that we take advantage of to either punish or push back the Chinese?
There are two things I would do off the top of my head, and I could probably think of more if you give me a few minutes. But the first thing I would do is I would tell Mako, you should look into Section 337 of the Trade Act, because this is something that gives you a right to ban the import of items that take away, that are theft of your trade secrets or your trade dress or anything like that, or your trademarks. There's all kinds of protections, and it's a private right of action where you can get an exclusion order. So that's the first thing I tell them. Second thing I would say at USTR is this is the kind of thing where under the Phase 1 dispute settlement arrangement, there are supposed to be monthly, quarterly, semi-annual meetings where you can take this to the Chinese, and the whole purpose of these meetings are to identify these issues and resolve them before they blow up into bigger issues and end up in tariffs escalating and that kind of thing. And those are the kinds of processes that I would expect to see.
Thank you for that. Of course, you're not there any longer. Based on the current makeup, if MAKO did what you suggested, would there be any retribution? Would there be any relief?
So it depends. So first of all, with the Section 337, if your case is successful, you can get an exclusion order where those things are not allowed to come into the United States. So that's strong relief. With respect to the Phase 1 agreement enforcement, the whole purpose is to go to the Chinese, say, here's the problem, go to your people and have them fix it. And because they're authoritarian, it's a little easier for them to do that than it might be for us. So there are ways to secure relief. It's not always easy, but there are processes you can go through to pursue it.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. And of course, that would, not only MAKO, that would apply to any other similarly situated company with the same circumstances.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Sewell from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I first would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. In order for us to truly address the People's Republic of China's harmful trade policies, we need more than rhetoric. We need action. I think all of you on this panel would agree on that. I am proud that the Biden administration has taken decisive action. First, we in the Congress under President Biden took a major step to combat China's growing influence by passing the historic Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. By modernizing our infrastructure for the 21st century and investing in working families, America will be better positioned to compete with China for decades to come. Also, congressional Democrats and President Biden passed the America Competes Act, which is the boldest legislation in our country's history to directly confront China's anti-free trade policies and practices, and to promote American workers. As we've continued to advance a worker-centered trade agenda, Congress must be more active in combating China's anti-free market practices and ensure that our steelworkers can compete on a level playing field. That is why I will soon be reintroducing the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. This bipartisan legislation will modernize our anti-dumping and countervailing duty enforcement laws to push back against China's Belt and Road Initiative, combat China's circumvention of U.S. laws, and target repeat offenders. These are common sense bipartisan solutions to protect American workers and get tough on China's free market practices. Moreover, today I am joining my colleague, Representative Bose, to introduce the bipartisan Fighting Trade Cheaters Act, which will increase civil penalties for fraudulent and grossly negligent violations of the U.S. trade laws. These two bills are concrete examples of legislation that will directly combat People's Republic of China's illegal trade practices, and I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will sign on to the bills and, more importantly, get them passed. Mr. Hausman, can you expand on the steelworkers, on how the steelworkers have been impacted by some of the current loopholes in the anti-dumping and countervailing duties laws? And do you think that the passage of the Leveling the Playing Field 2.0 would be helpful to steelworkers and other workers in my district and across the United States?
Thank you for the question, Representative. United Steelworkers were strong supporters of Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 in the 117th Congress, and when the bill is introduced, I'm pretty sure we'll endorse again. And one of the reasons is, for example, tire workers. You know, we represent, we're the largest union in tire manufacturing. We represent over half of domestic passenger vehicle light truck duty tires. And we've had to do 5 anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, including 2 on PVLT. The first one was against China, successful. We hands down proved that 50 million tires were coming into the market, and just dumped at low costs, just to kind of capture market share and negatively impact. We lost 5,000 workers in that industry during that period of time. We were successful there, but then 3 years later, the union had, a few years later, the union had to put out another AD/CVD case. And we saw imports rise very quickly from companies that also, quite frankly, have parent companies that are based in China. And so they just basically shifted production to third-party countries and just started shifting and putting those tires back into the market. We filed that case, and we're successful in that anti-dumping and countervailing duty case as well. But it would have been easier with your Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. These successive cases, and particularly third country subsidies from China, are key items to address. And then, the union is familiar with the Fighting Trade Cheats bill, which was introduced by Senator Brown and Tillis over on the Senate side. Look, we think the idea of enhanced penalties for bad actors is a right idea. I mean, the idea that these importers continuously evade and break the law. Like, for example, there's been 3 IEPA requests, investigations that have found evidence of Chinese-owned company operating in the Dominican Republic, where they brought in aluminum extrusions and transshipped through the Dominican Republic to avoid duties. Multiple cases now. We should be able to attack and address those sorts of repeat offenders and repeat importers and provide meaningful penalties and potentially knock them off the list from being able to import. Sorry, I know I went over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for allowing him to go a little bit over. And I would encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to look into both of those bills. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you to our witnesses for participating here today. I think a timely discussion, one that focuses on solutions as well. So thank you for sharing your expertise, your insight, your ideas, and solutions. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made a part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.